Hello everyone, welcome to the Northwest Basin and Range Conservation Project informational webinar. I'm Todd Hopkins, Science Coordinator for the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative. For those of you that may be new to conservation cooperatives, we are a public-private partnership working to meet large-scale conservation challenges across the 5-state Great Basin region. Besides myself today, we have two other speakers, Tom Mewald, a geographer with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and John Casbaum, the Sheldon Hart Refuge Complex Manager. For more about us and the LCC in this project, visit the project website down at the bottom there. We'll keep things up to date and post this webinar and the slides and all other products and things from this effort up on that website. We'll keep today's presentation fairly short, probably just 35 minutes, and we're going to reserve the last part of the hour for questions and discussion, and we'd really like to hear from you what we didn't cover, what you were worried about, what you think this project can do for you. That's really where we're going to gather information from you. Since there are lots of folks in the webinar, we're asking that you type in your questions as they arise. We'll read out your questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation, and today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website. So let me tell you what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to tell you how to ask questions in case you haven't done that on a webinar. We'll cover the who, what, where, and why about this project. How does this work? Our approach, the so what for the project. Okay, so you've heard the webinar, so what? And then we're going to hear questions from you. And most importantly, we also have, for those that registered, a 5-minute survey at the end that you'll get through email. One of the questions on that survey is really important to us, and it involves how we should engage stakeholders in this project. So we really want you to spend 2 or 3 minutes on that. Give us some solid input on how we should engage stakeholders, and if you have experience with processes like this, we'd love to hear about it. So let's cover how to ask questions. We have a bar on the right, on the very up-hand right corner. You see that little red arrow. By clicking on the small arrow button, you can expand the control panel, and in the expanded control panel down at the bottom, you can send in a question. So you type your question into that chat area and press send. And this question will be sent to us to respond to if it's a clarifying question during the webinar or at the end of the webinar in the Q&A session. We have someone monitoring the chat box while we're speaking, so go ahead and type something in whenever you think about it. So let's talk about the where and the what. This area is known as the Northwest Basin and Range ecoregion. It's northwestern Nevada and southeastern Oregon, and the project area inside the blue boundary is about 20 million acres. Landscape conservation projects are non-regulatory cooperative landscape conservation processes. We are going to identify ecologically connected areas likely to be resilient under climate change that support a broad range of plants and animals under these changed conditions. Conservation projects provide information on where to sustain natural and cultural resources across the landscape, what conservation actions might be needed, how much, and who might contribute to those actions. Landscape conservation projects are not new. There are at least 30 of them going on nationwide right now, and some are already done. Funding for this project came from the Resilient Landscapes Initiative from the Office of Wildland Fire. This particular area, the Northwest Basin and Range, is very special. A lot of private landowners, nonprofit organizations, state and federal agencies, and tribes have designated priority areas. If you look on the map on the left-hand side, you'll see the number of priority areas that we've found already designated on this landscape. And you can see that some of them have as many as 6 priorities assigned to them by various organizations. This is a biological hotspot for migratory birds and a stronghold for pronghorn antelope. The area has altered fire regimes, invasive species, water scarcity, development, and climate change acting on the landscape. We've been doing some background work, and Tom and his crew have identified over 60 existing plans and assessments for this area alone. So there are lots of multiple overlapping priorities, and that's why we're doing this project here. We have 2 fairly straightforward project goals. We want to synthesize the existing landscape planning and science to develop a shared conservation vision for stakeholders in the region. very important. This is a stakeholder-driven process. We do not have any outcomes or anything like that planned at this time. We know the types of products we want and the kinds of things that might happen, but we need stakeholders to tell us what's valued on the landscape and where their shared priorities are. We're not reinventing the wheel. We are using existing completed plans and in some cases plans in process. Participation is voluntary. Everything this project comes up with is non-directive, that is voluntary. This is not a federal or a regulatory process. The project data will be publicly available, and meeting notes, webinars like this, and other work products will be posted on the project website. So we intend to work collaboratively with state and federal natural resource managers. We have 3 tribes in the area, project area, private landowners, and we're going to be addressing landscape scale actions again for shared priorities. Now everybody's going to have their own priorities, and some of them may not be important to everybody. So we will try to find the ones that are most common to everybody in the project area and focus on where there is already great agreement. So who's working on this? Well, I mentioned the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative at the outset. That's who I work for. Our mission statement is there, and you can see that this is exactly the kind of thing that we were established to do, to work across regions and promote coordination of science-based actions. We also have members from the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Refuges Program and in the Partners Program. And the mission there is, again, beginning with 3 important words that says working with others. Those 3 words tell us we can't do this alone. We shouldn't do it alone. We should consult with others before we go ahead and try to do any part of that mission. And again, everything's up on that website down at the bottom. There are 5 principles for this project. As I've mentioned, it's an open, non-regulatory, stakeholder-based effort. We're going to be working on adaptation strategies, incorporating climate change, and other foreseeable land uses. A lot of land use planning up in this area, counties, states, everybody. We're going to gather those plans and see what they're forecasting. We're going to complement existing planning and local knowledge. Again, we're not reinventing it. We're not redoing it. We're taking what everybody has already created and mashing it all together. We're going to promote connectivity and ecological and physical processes across the landscape. There are a lot of wide-ranging species on this landscape, and we'd like to make sure they can range widely for a long time in the future. And lastly, because we're funded by the Office of Wildland Fire for this, we really want to make sure we incorporate fire resiliency to support wildland fuels efforts in this area and BLM and the state's efforts in this project. So now I'm going to turn it over to John Kasbaum, the complex manager for Sheldon Hart Refuge.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is John Kasbaum. As Todd said, I'm the project leader or complex manager for Sheldon Hart Refuges out of Lakeview, Oregon. Tom and Todd asked me to talk a little bit about a manager's perspective on why it's appropriate to participate in this landscape conservation project. So just to start out, we are 2 of 3 national wildlife refuges in the greater landscape that you can see outlined on the map. Sheldon to the south, Hart Mountain in the center, and then Malheur Refuge to the north here. This is important to us as we manage a wide array of high desert sage steppe wildlife that use the area not only on the refuges but on a landscape scale, including pronghorn and sage grouse. But we're only a small part of this greater area, and in order to be successful, we really need to look outside of our boundaries and work with others to be successful in our wildlife mission. So next slide. So in 1997, Congress directed all refuges in the National Wildlife Refuge System to develop a comprehensive conservation plan. By 2012, most of those, or not all of those, have been completed. Then these are basically our land management plans for each unit. So they're done on a 15-year planning horizon or period, and they obviously will require revision at the end of that process. Part of the revision process, we're required to look at landscape level issues first. So given our 2 stations and the importance of sage grouse and other species, This South Central Oregon, Northwest Nevada area is a clear priority not only for our refuges, but also for the Fish and Wildlife Service in general. So we believe the timing is appropriate for this effort. Numerous plans have already been developed, whether it's statewide action plans, resource management plan revisions, all of the sage grouse planning that's gone on, and there are a wide array of other plans underway. So I think the idea is to pull commonalities together from all these sources, to build upon them, to complement them, and not repeat the wheel, and learn how and understand how our units fit into the greater landscape picture. So for us directly, the Heart Mountain Comprehensive Conservation Plan is due for revision. The last plan was done in 1994, quite a few years back, and we have started that revision process. So given service policy to look at landscape issues, and because we and others have identified several landscape issues here as priorities, we need to be looking beyond our boundaries and working with others, or we likely won't be successful over the long run for the species that we manage. So basically, the landscape conservation project should help us understand how our units fit into the greater context, and we can incorporate shared resource issues, priorities, and goals from the landscape project into the Heart Mountain Plan now, and then these will allow us to develop refuge goals and strategies to meet not only our priorities, but also contribute to those shared by our neighbors. Next slide.
Am I one ahead, John?
No, you're good. You're right there. I forgot to tell you to switch, and you did. So, for example, the Sheldon Hart refuges, we manage numerous species that you can see some of those here on the list: pronghorn, red band trout, cheatgrass, pygmy rabbits. They all use this area in a landscape context, not just the footprint that we manage. So it's, again, important to be working with others in the surrounding area. So lastly, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a current landscape level project that's getting underway right now that might have benefited from a landscape design as this project will deliver, and that has to do with the pygmy rabbit. So right now, numerous partners, these are several here that listed, are collaborating on a pygmy rabbit study to address issues on a landscape scale. This effort was started by the Nevada Department of Wildlife with the University of Reno. Earlier this year, we were asked if we would like to participate in trying to expand that onto Sheldon Refuge, and we were fortunately in the position to be able to join in with additional funding and help expand that project up through Heart Mountain and the lands in between both refuges. We're doing this because pygmy rabbits are also an important species to us, in addition to the other agencies listed. Next slide. So the point here is that this project is addressing shared priorities for better understanding of landscape level issues. But I think it came about more, at least from the refuge's perspective, because the stars kind of lined up for us rather than because of true collaborative planning. So had we had a landscape conservation project like this completed and a framework in place, I think we would have been better able to support the project and plan for its inception and to get it accomplished. So we see the LCD, or the Landscape Conservation Project, as a place to pull existing goals and priorities across the area together so that the most important things can be identified and that each partner entity might be better able to work together, not only to achieve their goals, but also the greater conservation priorities for the landscape. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Todd and Tom.
Tom, this is your turn.
Okay. Thanks, John, and thanks, Todd. So I'll talk a little bit about, kind of how we're thinking of doing this. And again, kind of like Todd said, we're keeping it very open, so we don't have like a detailed 20-step process here. It's more of, kind of what are the main elements of this roadmap and what are the key things that we might get out of it at the end, knowing that we want to keep this open because we want folks' input on how to do this, and we need people's input on that. So The first thing that we've heard from a number of folks is that, yeah, there's been a lot of plans out there. A lot of sage-grouse planning was just done, and for other species. And they covered, different species, different sub-geographies, and different parts of the landscape. They don't get at that cohesive picture that we're looking at. But still, what we're, the first step is really to synthesize existing plans and assessments. Next. The second thing is, we're going to put all this information together and do our best to compile this information within a common framework. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we really want to get your input. How do we put things together? Is this making sense? Can you add anything to this? Are there things that should be priorities to that? And and then finally getting to the next part of the approach is identifying collaborative strategies. Once we kind of do this meta assessment of plans, if you will, we should be able to find those common priorities that John was alluding to, such as with the pygmy rabbit. And then can we start to develop collaborative strategies? Again, this is non-regulatory, as Todd mentioned. This is, how can we develop those partnerships and needs at the landscape scale? Next slide. So we know there's a lot of plans out there. The ecoregional, the rapid ecoregional assessment by the BLM is a great start. It covers a larger area, and it looks at a lot of the things that anybody would look at in this geography. There's also been a lot of local planning and state-based planning for particular species, such as the Oregon sage-grouse plan. The Western Governors Association chat looked at a broad suite of species as well and targeted habitats. And there's been a number of other finer scale plans across the landscape, and you can flip through those and see that there have been a number of different plans for a number of different species. So kind of job one that we want to do is look at these plans and look at what are those common vital signs that these plans and assessments are saying about the landscape, and how can we synthesize them together to get a more holistic view of the landscape. And I think we can do this using an approach. Next slide. And we all have our own landscape scale adaptive management approaches. The BLM has their landscape approach that, the rapid ecoregional assessment falls into that. And then also the next step is, how do we get to strategies, and how do we get to what the Fish and Wildlife Service might be calling conservation delivery at the ground. So at the end, we don't want this to be just another assessment. We'd like this to be this synthesis of assessments that lead to these common and shared strategies and priorities across the landscape. And you can flip through those, just examples of other wheels that are out there that get at this concept of adaptive management. Next slide. The approach that we'll be using, if you're familiar with the open standards for conservation, this is a method and tool that basically brings together a lot of the commonalities embedded within these different adaptive management cycles or wheels. And so we'll be using this as a way to find those commonalities across these different plans, realizing that everybody has kind of their own way of looking at adaptive management, but I think we can find those commonalities, and through those commonalities we can, and by mining these existing plans, we're hoping to find those shared priorities and that lead to collaborative strategies. Next slide. Todd showed this map earlier, so this is a map showing these places that we can already see that there's overlap in interests and overlap in priorities amongst a number of different efforts out there. This doesn't include the state COAs yet, just because they're in the process of completing those right now, but that would be another one of those. And so that's another component beyond, the looking at the different plans. This is a very spatially enabled process. So some of the products that come out of this will be data sets and assessments at the landscape scale. Next slide. Of particular interest, we'll be synthesizing spatial data that's out there, and we'll be looking at shared priorities within the lens of recent spatial data and assessments, particularly climate change. I think that's going to be an important part of this project, developing climate-smart strategies at the landscape scale. So we have these shared priorities and these shared priority areas. What are the current threats in terms of climate change, and how can we develop strategies around that? We're also looking at land cover and vegetation. There's a lot of data that's been produced there, so how do we put that information together? And then we're also looking at, what are some shared priority species that we can model and see the impacts at the landscape scale. So just to give you a sense of some of the outputs that will be coming out of this, and next slide.
Tom, I think I cut your slide out.
No, I think that's fine. That's it. You're good. So, just envisioning some products and outcomes of this so we can kind of think of what a final landscape conservation project might look like at the end is, one, it's going to be the synthesis of existing plans and science and data, and we hope that will be of utility to multiple people, and we're glad that the LCCs are part of this project, because that is really a great role and niche for the LCCs, is to play that role of synthesizing information and plans. We want to get review and buy-in from stakeholders on how we put this information together, and get engagement as well from folks in the region. As John stated, one of the things we want to understand is what is the contribution of management units such as the refuge system to the overall conservation goals, and can we get at that kind of information for other management units across the area, and working with managers out there on getting to that understanding. We want to identify gaps in protection or attention. We realize we all kind of know now the success we've had with that landscape approach of looking at sage grouse, and are there other species such as pygmy rabbit, other pronghorn, or others that can warrant such a comprehensive and systematic look at species at the landscape scale? And from that, kind of the common theme is identifying common goals and strategies at the landscape scale. And finally, we don't want to develop a 3-volume, 400-page assessment that sits on a shelf. We want to hopefully develop some intuitive and useful products interface to this information on the web that will make you want to go to this place, the outcome of this project, and understand what we've done. And so that kind of gives a broad overview of process and products that will come out of this. Again, a lot of details need to be worked out, and we hope to work with people in the region. And that's all I got, Todd.
Thanks, Tom. So I just want to review for a minute why, if it isn't clear yet, we're doing this, and that's because plants and species don't go by geopolitical boundaries. They go wherever they want to go, especially large landscape species. You've got deer and elk and migratory birds. We want to conserve resilient and adaptable ecosystems, and it's a significant challenge. So we're trying to gather all the smart people we can and all the plans we can find, and look for those commonalities and shared visions. And just like I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife mission statement and also our mission statement, these challenges cannot be addressed or taken on by one single agency or organization. We have to look beyond our own organizational boundaries to achieve this shared conservation vision. And this is something that has been done around the landscape in a number of places. I mentioned there are over 30 of them in process, and several of them done around the United States already. So as we mentioned, there are other projects out there, and some of the other conservation planning projects have used their products to do things like designate grasslands of significance. The NRCS has used that. Sage Grouse Initiative has used some of the planning outcomes from this. BLM has used these outcomes to apply for healthy lands funding for restoration on their landscapes. So having a group of stakeholders collaboratively identify key resources and shared priorities actually builds your case if you want to do conservation or restoration on the landscape. And so that's another reason to help us with this effort. Tom mentioned some of the products. We just wanted to say that in addition, we're really committed to evaluating what we do. All of the things we do will have surveys and follow-up, and we really encourage you to take the survey at the end of the webinar so you can tell us not only who you are and what organizations you represent, but what you would do differently or how you would like us to engage stakeholders. That's really important for us. That's part of the reason for having this. And I think we're at a point now where you've heard something about the project. We tried to keep it brief, and we'd like to hear your questions or comments. So please go to the little box up on the top right and type in your questions or comments, and we will have them read out and the appropriate person will answer.
All right, Todd, we've got one question here for you to start with, and that is, what do you currently feel will lead to stakeholder buy-in, given this is voluntary and most managers are already overextended too much on their plate?
We're hoping that they'll find some utility and some common ground in this. It's every time you do this kind of thing, and I've done a few, and Tom has done a few, we hear this. It's been done before. I'm too busy. That's why we want to know how best to engage stakeholders. If it's a fine-scale 30-minute interview where we really just hammer on 2 or 3 questions, great. If it's a half-day stakeholder meeting or an evening meeting or a weekend meeting that we can get some private landowners to, we're committed to doing that. So part of this is trying to find the most painless but effective way to do just that, garner stakeholder input.
I have a.
So Liz, we have one here in the room. Can we take that?
Yes, please do.
I'm just curious, and you kind of outlined the approach. Where would you say this project currently is in that process?
So we have a group of people working on gathering up the assessments and plans and putting them into geospatial referenced software if we can. Some of them aren't spatially based, and so that's a little more challenging. We are in the process of hiring a coordinator, someone who will be living up in Lakeview and be the front end of the project and going around and working with all the folks. And that's where we are. So we have, and we didn't mention this, we should, we have a year and a half worth of funding. So about a year from now, we hope to have a very, very draft kind of a plan for this whole landscape.
Yeah, I would say though, yeah, that kind of covers it, Todd. We're at the pretty much research phase of things, where we're still trying to understand, you know, the plans out there and who's doing what in terms of data and data collection and different processes that are already ongoing. So we're kind of at that research stage right now, and once the coordinator gets on board, we'll take a different phase.
So Liz, I have another question here in the room if you haven't got one.
We've got about 4 or 5 here. So let me just give you one real quick because it's a follow-up, and it's just asking for a little bit more clarification on the timeline of the project.
So we have about a year's worth of funding for the project. It kicked off a couple months ago. As you know, it takes a little time to get everything together. We've added, the Great Basin LCC has added some funding to the coordinator's position, so we have about a year and a half of worth of funding for that. And that's about where we are. We're hoping to go back in for funding in the next fiscal cycle and see if we can hopefully get some more to continue this project down the road. Go ahead with your other questions, Liz. We'll wait here.
Okay, the next question is, private landowners control much of the water resources. How do you plan to incentivize them to participate?
That's a very good question. I don't have a distinct plan in mind, mostly just through collaborative processes. We have some folks with the Fish and Wildlife Partners program that have a lot of experience working with private landowners. Tom or John, do you have an answer?
Nothing right now.
If you have a suggestion on that, put it in the comment box at the survey at the end. We'd love to hear from you. Good point. Let's have the next one, Liz.
So the next one is, the BLM has committed to doing a quote-unquote step down after the rapid ecoregional plan. This sounds like a step down. Is it serving in that role? And if not, how will it interface with a step down?
This is essentially the step down. It wasn't planned out that way, but in fact we have talked to the BLM folks around the region and in their headquarters offices, and it's what they would call eco-regional direction. So this will serve as the step down for this region, and we're being watched quite closely by BLM, in fact, because they want to see if this process could work for that in other areas.
And Todd, for those who aren't familiar with the step down, could you give a little background on that? That was
well, essentially it's what we're doing. It's trying to take an assessment on the landscape of what's out there and what the priorities are, and then bring that down to the project level for the districts and the field offices, so that where they're implementing their programs, whether it be anything, it will help guide them. This is something that is part or considered in something called Planning 2.0, which is the new planning process that the BLM is using. So again, we're a bit of a pilot for them, even though they didn't fund this directly. They're part of the Office of Wildland Fire. But we're hoping that this will provide enough guidance, voluntary guidance, that the BLM districts and field offices can use at the local scale, private landowners can use, and the tribes as well.
Okay, the next question for you is, how are the local governments involved in the process as stakeholders? What do you see as their role?
So everybody here is considered a co-equal stakeholder in this process. We're not putting one above the other, especially because it's a voluntary engagement. We have, I'm not sure if we've contacted the county planners yet, but we have their names and contact information. And we're early in the process. We're going to go sit down with them in person and talk through this kind of thing. County planners are very astute, and they know a lot more about the foreseeable future for their counties. So we'd like to get their information and see what they can tell us as well. They'll definitely be engaged if we can keep them, if they have enough time and whatnot.
Okay, and then there was a question about, do you already have funding for the web-based interactive tool?
I don't think we do. We have the website up and places to put things. Tom, do we have, is that tool part of your effort?
Yeah, I mean, that could be, but I think that's one of the things that we want to work towards, and we'll find funding to meet that as a project goal. But yeah, I think that there's funding for that.
We have an idea of what that tool would look like and be, but we haven't got all the funding for the entire program. But if whoever asked that question has funding, please send it along.
Yeah, I know.
And then one more question here is, are you getting collaboration from the grazing/ranching community? A lot of project implementation relies on their cooperation.
It sure does. We have not reached out to them yet. This is why we're doing these two informational webinars. We know that the audience here is likely to be mostly state, federal, and some NGOs. We're hoping there's some private landowners, but time is money and they're working. So we have to, you're right, exactly right. We have to incentivize this project as much as we can for their participation in terms of water rights in the grazing community and everybody else. This needs to be something people see as valuable and worth their time. And working with the private landowners I'm very sensitive to the fact they can't spend a lot of time in meetings. They've got work to do and a job that keeps them busy day in, day out, seven days a week.
Yeah, and that's really where this coordinator position is going to come in. This person will be being that interface between the project and a whole host of stakeholders, including private lands out there.
Great, and the only other thing that I have in our question box is actually just a comment, and it is just kind of as an FYI, and they're saying the SEASWA is currently launching a program to crowdsource information about petition species. These workflows may be useful for the project you presented, and then they sent us a link to an example. So that's just an FYI for you guys. If you have any questions from the room, feel free to take those as well.
Yeah, thanks for that comment.
Yes, thank you. We don't have any more questions in the room here.
We just got one more on the question box, which is you have to consider not only private landowners, but also the public land ranching community. Actually, that's more of a comment.
Yes, yes, indeed. I'm based here in Reno in the BLM office, actually, so I have a lot of the range folks sitting all around me. That's a very astute comment. We need to be thoughtful about that as well. Well, Liz, if there are no additional questions, I think we will wrap this up. Please do take the survey afterwards. Again, if there's a comment you want to say or something that you didn't feel making public, we'd like to hear it. We're open to all kinds of constructive criticism. As I said, this process is going to have lots of evaluation in it, so we'd like to hear from you about what you thought of the webinar and the project in general, and especially if you'd be willing and interested to participate. That's really important. So on behalf of myself, Tom Mewald, and John Kasbaum, we thank you very much for your time today. Have a good day.